I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time at the OOFTAS collective symposium, and just a little bit about myself. I'm a PhD student, so this is me peeling off and presenting one very tiny aspect of my doctoral study. I'm a Canadian student studying in the UK, and I used to be a high school teacher in my two subject areas. People seem to think are weird. It was physics and English literature. And so then when I got out into schools, I taught. So my undergrad was a double major, physics and English, just for fun. And then I got out and taught in schools. And of course, I was assigned to teach maths and English and physics, but not all at the same school, because that's not really the way that schools are organized. So at one school, I was the math physics person, and in a different job, I was just the English person. Two sides of me. And then I went on to do a master's in physics research, and that was very different to what I am doing now in education research. So really excited to be here and to show you a little bit about my study. So today I'm talking about which teaching tasks pose the biggest difficulty for out-of-field teachers' self-efficacy. And the intro to this will be things that, of course, everyone is probably quite familiar with in this group, but specialized knowledge varies across the sciences. I don't think I have to make much of an argument for that, but these are just two exam questions from actually an Alberta provincial exam, so at the end of high school leaving stage. And I'm trained in physics, and I have no idea what the correct answer is to that biology question, but I can tell you that it's something squishy and it's a cell. So if you assign me to teach a biology class, I would not be a good candidate. But I can talk to you a lot about the torsion balance in the physics diagram there. And so, of course, the different sciences, the different disciplines there, we have specialized language and terminology, but also different experimental methods. We have different equipment, different safety considerations for teachers in the classroom. You know, that they really are, I think we all know that they're quite different and distinct. So then what is out-of-field teaching? To this group, not a shock. It's a mismatch between a teacher's specialized knowledge and the classes they're assigned to teach. But I do really like some of these quotes. I think you mentioned one of them as well, Yasser. A misuse of teachers, going back to the 60s there. Education's dirty little secret from the 80s. And I really like the central quote there. An important problem because highly qualified teachers may actually become highly unqualified. I don't like that term, but if they're assigned to teach subjects for which they have little training or education. And as a teacher myself, I do feel like teachers are our absolute best resource in education. And if we're not properly using them and looking at what they bring to the table, then we're doing them a disservice, and we're doing our classrooms a disservice within education. So from that, I think also in this group, it's quite clear that it's easy-ish to give a broad definition. And even though out-of-field teaching is a term that I had not heard when I was a teacher, and it's not used in Canada whatsoever, but we also don't really have another term for it because we don't talk about this at all. There's not a lot of research in it. So that's another thing. If anyone knows of any, I'd love to hear. But every teacher that I've ever spoken to in my study and otherwise in Canada, as soon as I briefly explain the concept in a broad way, they immediately, oh, didn't know there was a term for that. They immediately know what I'm talking about because it's so commonplace. And they go, wow, yeah, no, I've really struggled with that and this or that, right? So it's very understood in that broad sense, but actually much more difficult to properly define and capture or to measure in some way. And of course, then on the next, to support or deal or manage. So the theoretical framework for my study is social cognitive theory, and that provides the concept of self-efficacy, which I'm using teacher self-efficacy. It's an agentic theory, so to me, it pushes back a little bit against what I felt as a teacher was a lack of teacher agency, a lack of control over that assignment of what you're teaching. And so I specifically chose a theoretical basis that kind of pushed back against that. And this really is central to my whole study because it places the individual, it places my teachers at the center of the study. All of the data that I collect is directly from the teachers, and it's self-reported data only. And that's kind of based in my my positionality of valuing teachers within this. So what is teacher self-efficacy? It's a teacher's belief in essentially their capability to do specific teaching tasks in a particular context. Teacher self-efficacy, and actually self-efficacy, is a very specialized, it's a contextually based component of self-identity kind of aspects. So, you know, I might have, it's not the same as overall confidence, right? I might have a high self-efficacy in standing up in front of a group of people, but a really low self-efficacy when it comes to cutting hair. So you should not ask me to do that. If you need sort of convincing of the validity of teacher self-efficacy as a concept there, it has been shown to have a relationship with externally evaluated measures of teacher effectiveness. But of course, I'm using teacher self-efficacy on purpose because I see teachers as the best source of knowledge about themselves. So to me, when I think about teacher effectiveness or competency, I did not want to go into classrooms and kind of evaluate teachers. I wanted them to be able to report how they felt their capability with different aspects of teaching. And there are lots of links between lower teacher self-efficacy and, you know, intents to leave or things like that in the classroom. There's also a link between student achievement and teacher self-efficacy, but I would point out that with that link, it's not causal, because one of the sources of teacher self-efficacy is sort of mastery experiences. And so when your students are doing well, it should feed into your self-efficacy in that. So I have 3 research questions for my doctoral study, but I'm focusing on one of them today, and I've broken it down into a specific aspect of it because this is just a piece that I wrote up recently for my findings chapter for my thesis. So this is research question 1 for me. What is the relationship between teaching out of field in high school sciences and mathematics and teacher self-efficacy in these subjects? And today I'm really going to be talking about within that, if there are differences between in and out of field teachers' self-efficacy, which teaching tasks specifically are posing the largest comparable difficulty for teachers who are teaching out of field. So I really want to know at the specific level of the items that I've used. So the context and the methods for my study, that is a map of Canada. Canada has 13 provinces and territories, and education is at the provincial, not the federal level in Canada. So I selected the 4 Western provinces, partially because they're the ones I'm most familiar with. I held teaching licenses for both BC and Alberta, and I lived in Manitoba, but also because of the similarities in the initial teacher education and the way that the certifications work in those provinces. And in most of Canada, in those provinces in particular, you apply to a teacher education program for secondary school based on your previous degree, your specialization area, your subject area. But then when you come out of your teacher education program, your actual certificate, you know, your license to teach says that you can teach kindergarten to grade 12 any subject. So that's the way. It was very interesting to hear about Texas. I like that you reacted to, yep, our teachers. So I went in with physics and English as my 2 teachable areas, and that was declared within my program where I did my teacher education. But I was very surprised to receive my certificate in the mail that said kindergarten to grade 12, all subjects. If you put me in front of a kindergarten class, both they and I would be in tears. So that's the kind of context of those provinces. I used the methods of an online questionnaire and interviews by video call. All of the teachers involved, the inclusion criteria was that they be teaching grades 9 to 12 in the current academic year of 2020 to 2021, which was a pandemic year. Great timing. And grades 9 to 12, just for reference, that's the final 4 years of our high school, of our secondary education system. So my participants I had 220 questionnaire participants, and I'm focusing on them today because I'm really only using questionnaire data in this presentation, but I then went on to interview in depth 16 of them. They have an average age of 42 years old, and they're quite experienced, especially when I've worked on now a couple of international studies and TALIS work and things, and I see the average years of teaching experience on a lot of those to be around 10. My sample is quite experienced at an average of 16 years of teaching. 55% women, and their educational background, just because of how standardized it is in Canada and in these Western provinces, 98% of them have completed a teacher training program. So not a lot of alternatively qualified teachers. And 33%, a third of them have a master's degree. If you look at the total provincial populations there, I wasn't intending for this sample to be representative or anything, but it's just interesting to note that that's the comparative populations, just entire total population in those provinces. And I recruited just as absolutely widely and everywhere that I could. And it, the uptake was similar in every province. So that's just nice to note, even though I'm not trying to be representative in any way. So how did I measure teacher self-efficacy? I used the teacher sense of efficacy scale to measure teacher self-efficacy. I don't know if any other people in the group here have done work on teacher self-efficacy. One question that you have might be, why didn't I use the STEBI, which is the teacher self-efficacy scale that's specific for science? And that is a detailed conversation I'd love to have later. But this is a widely used, the TSES is widely used, and it's very common in mixed method studies. It has 24 items, each rated on a scale of 1 to 9, and they load onto these 3 factors, which are instructional strategies, classroom management, and student engagement. And the sort of unique thing that I did with this scale was that I made it subject specific. There were a lot of calls in the literature towards this, that teacher self-efficacy is not a general, as I said in the beginning, self-efficacy is not a generalized concept. It really is, it's so specific. And so a lot of calls that said teacher self-efficacy is often measured in this very general way, where you just ask a teacher these questions about their teaching in general. And when I think about high school teachers and my experience of that, my teacher self-efficacy would vary a lot in different subjects. So I took this, I tweaked as few words as possible in every item to essentially add, how well can you establish routines to keep activities running smoothly in your physics classroom? And then I just replaced that word on each of the different subjects. And my questionnaire that I used actually covered all of the possible subjects in those 4 provinces, were all grouped and fell into these umbrellas. And so I had this for 14 different subject areas. And then as teachers went through that questionnaire, every subject that they teach, they filled out the subject specific instrument for that. So some teachers, it was a very annoying questionnaire. I just was absolutely touched that anybody filled it out at all. But some teachers filled out only 2 subject things. Maybe they just teach general science and maths or something. And other teachers, especially in really rural areas of Canada, filled out 8. And it took them obviously a lot longer to fill that out, the same instrument for all 8 of their subjects. But that has given me a lot of really interesting data, which for the most part, I won't go into today. So in there, I have people specifically, it grasped people who were teaching out of field, but also people who were teaching in field. That was the part of the point, was to be able to just use all of that data in comparisons. So how did I determine their out of field status? I think, when we look back at the research in this over the past several decades, things have moved from this binary of in versus out of field to really a multidimensional construct. It's moved from possibly externally imposed criteria, where the researcher is looking at, okay, your educational background is this, and therefore, by my bar, you are in or out of field, to sometimes being self-rated or having the inclusion of these identity aspects. So things have really shifted, and that left me as a beginning person who had just showed up from physics and was only thinking about magnets to, okay, I'm not really sure how to wade through all of this. And here was what I created. Again, I wanted to ask the teachers themselves if they felt, how far out of field do they feel? But then I had to explain to them what out of field meant. I did that crafting a sentence that is brief, and I was very careful about the wording. I would love feedback on this, but of course it's done now. So keep that in mind. The sentence I gave them was, teaching out of field refers to teaching in an area, I didn't say subject, in an area that does not match with one's expertise, was the word that I went with. And then I asked them to rate that on a 4-point scale for each of these subjects that they taught. And then I asked them in an open text box response, why did you choose that rating? Those are some really interesting answers. And my scale is just 1 for not at all, I feel in field in this, and then slightly, moderately, and very out of field. And one of the other things somebody else raised today about, Jim, I think you mentioned the idea of years of experience in, teaching and then in each subject. So I collected that. I collected years of experience overall, and then in each of the subjects. And it was very interesting to look at people with 20 years of teaching experience. And this was the first year they'd been asked to teach maths, and they rated themselves as out of field and cited that as one of the reasons, things like that. So that was how I measured it. Looking at it by subject area in terms of the responses that I got. So that sample of 220 teachers, when you break it down into specific subjects, the sample breaks down into all these different pots, right? Where I have different numbers of teachers. And you can see that the in-field proportion there is, the majority by a slim margin on some of those subjects. But the slightly out of field is much more, people are much more comfortable responding that than they are saying I'm very out of field. Okay, there are some subjects there where nobody ticked that they were very out of field. But that's according to how they feel. I did also collect all of the data around educational background, going back to what things they took in their own high school education, as well as any other qualifications they deemed relevant. Oh, stop moving forward. So unfortunately, having collected it with a 4-point scale for this particular analysis, because of the small bin categories there, I've had to collapse it down to just in versus out of field. And I put that line at that if you chose any extent out of field, if you chose slightly, then I've put you in the category. So I refer to this as extent out of field, and any extent out of field is that they've selected a 2, 3, or a 4 on that scale. So moving into my findings, which are very dense charts that we're not going to talk through much of the specifics on this, but this is just for science. So science in these provinces goes up to age 16, and science refers to general science. It's a course that's taught with different units of study on each of biology, chemistry, physics. And so people think of it as general science, but the word science there also conveys this sense of the grade level. Whereas at the final 2 years of high school, it's split into physics, chemistry, and biology separately, taught by a separate teacher for each of those, or the ones you choose to take. Okay, so for science here, this looks at the groups in versus any extent out of field, and does a Mann-Whitney test to look at if there is a difference. And you'll see just the darkened rows there are the 3 factors. Okay, so instructional strategies, classroom management, and student engagement. And you can see for science, there is a statistically significant difference in each of those 3 factors for teachers' self-efficacy on that factor between out-of-field and in-field teachers. And it's quite, on most of those, it's quite significant and with a moderate or sometimes large effect size. Now I'm going to move through them quickly because I've done 5 subjects showing you all the same thing. So that was science, and it just looks like the color changes. That one is biology. Okay, and just very briefly, instructional strategies, still a really significant difference with a large effect size, whereas classroom management, not significant here for people teaching out of field in biology. And then student engagement, yes, significant, moderate effect size, moderate to large. And then we go to chemistry and we see similar things, and we go to physics and we see actually physics is quite different. Physics is quite different on a number of things. I have some ideas about that in my physics sample, but then we go to mathematics. This is where I had the largest sample of teachers within my set here, about 130. And then just to recap all of that and draw out actually what's really important from that. So out of those items, the scale itself had 24 items. And to adapt it to the sciences, I did add 2 additional items that were my own. But if you look at those on the item level and you look at the ones with the largest effect size, I wanted to know what are the biggest challenges for out-of-field teachers, teacher self-efficacy. And in mathematics, at the bottom of the stack there, the top 3 as in the one with the biggest effect size. And this is always a negative effect for out-of-field teachers always being rating lower on their teacher self-efficacy than in-field teachers. In mathematics, you see it's responding to difficult questions, providing alternative explanations or examples, and fostering student creativity. In physics, the out-of-field teachers are struggling the most with crafting good questions, responding to difficult questions, and providing alternative explanations or examples. In chemistry, struggling to respond to difficult questions, craft good questions. Okay, so there are some themes here. I'm going to change the color coding a little bit. Everything in green has to do with explanations and examples, and everything in blue has to do with questioning, either crafting or responding to questions. And so, there have really been some things that floated to the top as across the sciences and mathematics. These are really the specific tasks that teachers report struggling with on their own responses to their how they rate their capability in conducting these tasks. So with that, I'm closing on time. So just to conclude, one of the significant differences that it was the same across all of those 5 subjects was on the instructional strategies factor. And the teaching tasks that posed the largest difficulty seemed to be crafting good questions, responding to difficult questions, providing alternative explanations and examples, and providing real-world examples in the sciences. So with that, some references. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really keen to hear feedback and anything that you can tell me about anything you've read to do with Canadian out-of-field teachers. I have not found much whatsoever. Thanks so much.